Late afternoon, April 6, 1945, east of Okinawa. The sea is iron blue and indifferent. A small U.S. escort carrier rides the swell, her flight deck a sliver of wood and nerves. Engines cough, chuff, settle. FM-2 Wildcats squat at the catwalks like compact fists. TBM Avengers sit heavy with bombs and depth charges, their folded wings like praying hands. Down below, the ship hums, radar sets hissing, radios ticking, loaders feeding belts to 20mm and 40mm mounts. On the horizon, dust specks resolve into wings. More behind them, then more. The lookouts barely finish their calls before the fighter director's voice hardens into vectors. Angels 10, bogies inbound, many. On paper, the Japanese once called these jeep carriers cheap and slow. On this sky, contempt is a lethal error. Hellcats arc in from higher cover. Wildcats claw upward from the deck, and the first bursts of proximity-fused flak blossom like hard white flowers. The carrier shudders to general quarters. Deck crews flatten. A pilot snaps his canopy shut. The sky begins to burn. To understand how this moment became possible, how derided ships learned to survive mass attack, we need the world that built them, and the doctrine that armed them for it. They were never meant to look heroic. Escort carriers, CVEs, were born from industrial urgency, not naval romance. Shorter than fleet carriers, half their speed, a fraction of their air group, they were merchant hulls adapted to war. Boxy, serviceable, and everywhere. By 1943-44, they filled convoy lanes, ferried aircraft across oceans, and rode behind invasions like moving airstrips. Their decks were planked lung space for a navy that could not afford to wait for shipyard masterpieces. The logic was simple: build many, train quickly, stitch air cover over every vulnerable mile of sea, and every beachhead where Marines and soldiers would need bombs and rockets on call. In the Pacific, that meant the Gilberts in late 1943, the Marshalls in early 1944, the Marianas in June, and then, inevitably, Philippine waters. Each step demanded persistent air presence close to the troops. The big fleet carriers could not be everywhere. The CVEs closed the gaps. A typical CVE made 18-19 knots on a good day. Wind over the deck mattered. Launch cycles were timed to the sea's mood and the ship's limited speed. And every evolution was a choreography of inches. Tractors pushing FM-2 Wildcats to the forward end. TBM Avengers rolled aft for strike or anti-submarine patrol. Wing. Locks release, chocks out, throttles building. Where the fleet carrier's air group might approach 100 aircraft, a CVE lived with roughly 24 to 30, lean, purposeful numbers tuned to their missions. The Wildcats would take combat air patrol and point defense intercepts. The Avengers flowed between anti-submarine sweeps, torpedo runs when called, and close air support fitted with bombs or rockets. On the Atlantic lanes, those Avengers had already proved their worth, closing air gaps, pouncing on U-boats, forcing the enemy to dive at bad moments. In the Pacific, the same discipline met a different opponent, massed, often desperate air attack. The American learning curve was steep but relentless. In 1942, the Navy fought to keep any carrier alive. By 1943, doctrine congealed around radar, scouting, fighter direction officers, and layered screens of destroyers and destroyer escorts. CVEs absorbed this thinking in miniature. They gained better radar, tighter voice procedures, and anti-aircraft suites that grew more lethal with each refit. 5-inch dual-purpose guns where space allowed, 40mm Bofors in purposeful clusters, 20mm Oerlikons at the catwalks and corners. Gunners drilled until motions ran together, slew, led, squeezed, track, belts feeding, barrels smoking. It was not grace. It was repetition turned into survival. Across the water, the Japanese air arm moved along a different curve. Early war, confidence was earned in blood and skill. Pilots who had cut their teeth over China and in the first Pacific campaigns were elite. But a sharp apex has a steep descent. By 1943-44, a hard attrition grind, over the Solomons, the Bismarcks, the Central Pacific, pulled veterans from the roster faster than they could be replaced. Fuel shortages blunted training. Aircraft design still produced dangerous machines. But the average pilot's hours dropped and unit cohesion thinned. The result was paradox. Individual bravery remained, yet formation discipline and gunnery accuracy eroded at the edges. Against that trend, the U.S. Navy placed industrial depth. It produced the F-6F Hellcat, a broad-shouldered fighter built for forgiveness and durability, and it kept rolling out pilots with standardized training who could be slotted into a system and perform on day one. Escort carriers benefited from both currents, Hellcats overhead from the fast task forces, Wildcats and Avengers on their own decks to fill the near horizon with steel. The CVE mission set multiplied. Some days were pure ferry work. Dozens of fighters lashed to the deck bound for a forward base. Other days were hunter-killer groups at sea, a CVE at the center with escorts in a lethal ring, the air wing cycling out in four-plane anti-submarine searches while the ship threaded a box shaped by intelligence and hunches. In invasions, CVEs lived just offshore, close enough to hear artillery and smell cordite. They flew pre-dawn strikes to soften resistance, then orbiting support to answer, the radios of platoon leaders pinned down by a bunker or a ravine. They were not glamorous, but they were present. Presence is power in a war of distances. That very presence invited contempt. To many Japanese aviators, a CVE silhouette read like opportunity, a small flight deck, a low island, slow turns, not the muscular target of a fleet carrier with her stacked island and constant fighter swarms. Jeep carrier suggested softness, an auxiliary, a stepping stone to sink on the way to bigger prey. It was a misread of the total scene. A CVE did not sail alone. She lived under a web of pickets, patrols, and procedures. Her Wildcats might be fewer, but they were directed by radar with calm precision. Her deck looked crowded, but that density delivered a quick turn for cap launches and recovery. Her escorts threw up curtains of fire and, as 1944 matured into 1945, those curtains hardened into something deadlier than sighted bursts, the invisible timing of proximity fuses that detonated, shells in the air around an incoming aircraft, turning near misses into kill spheres. Step by step, the Pacific Campaign stitched CVEs into its fabric. In the Gilberts, they proved the close support concept. In the Marshalls, they refined the cycle. In the Marianas, the fast carriers broke the enemy's fighter corps while the CVEs kept the beachhead supplied with air. In the Philippines, they would face their harshest test yet, when conventional attack began to fuse with the deliberate crash diving of special attack units. Through it all, the escort carriers learned to live under pressure. Crewmen slept near their stations. Ordnancemen built new rhythms for arming loads under constant alert. Pilots learned to land on short decks in shifting winds, wounded and low, on fuel, because the mission's center was not the ship but the troops ashore and the convoy lifelines behind them. By the time the U.S. fleet gathered for Okinawa, the doctrine of layered defense was mature, and the Japanese, stripped of fuel and experience, were preparing to concentrate what remained into mass raids meant to break that layer by sheer number and will. The stage was set, small decks against large formations, industrial discipline against raw desperation, technology wrapped around human endurance. To grasp how those layers worked when the raids came, we need the next element, the machinery and methods that turned a CVE group from easy target into a hard, sustained firewall. The revolution that made Jeep carriers hard to kill was not a single weapon. It was a lattice. Sensors, guns, fuses, doctrine, and discipline, woven into a repeatable routine. Start with radar. By 1944 to 45, escort carriers and their screens carried surface and air search sets that pulled first sight out of haze and height. Operators learned the grammar of returns, altitude guesses from scope behavior, speed estimates from trace drift, track angles that hinted at intent. From that picture, the fighter direction officer translated dots into vectors. He spoke in clipped bearings and angels, stacking combat air patrol in altitude and assigning intercept geometries designed to force attackers to jettison early, split formation, or blunder into waiting Hellcats. The escort carriers might contribute their own Wildcats to the cap, but they also lived under the umbrella of fast carrier Hellcats ranging higher and farther. The point was a layered interception. Pick up early, meet high, bleed the raid before, It touched the ring of heavy guns. Those guns formed the second layer, and they changed in character across the war. The 5-inch 38 dual-purpose gun was already a naval classic, but in 1944 the arrival of the proximity, VT fuse, gave it a new personality. No longer did a near miss vanish into the wind. Shells detonated when they sensed an aircraft nearby, turning probability into volume. Cluster an incoming path with bursts, and a pilot faced a three-dimensional minefield. Closer in, the 40mm Bofors provided the hard, rhythmic punch of aimed automatic fire, chewing at wings and engines, while 20mm Oerlikons stitched fast arcs at the last 100 yards, an act of defiance against physics and inertia. Fire control directors, improved sights, and better ammunition supply chains kept these weapons fed with accuracy and urgency. Crews drilled the ready service dance until belts and clips moved as if on rails. The tone of battle, those deep 5-inch thumps and staccato Bofors beats, became the soundtrack of survival. Doctrine bound the layers. Destroyers and destroyer escorts formed screens at prescribed bearings and distances. Radar picket stations absorbed the risk to extend warning time. Voice nets standardized call signs and brevity codes so that different ships could cooperate under stress without tripping over language. Pilots too learned the cadence. Scramble on the bell, climb to the altitude block, acknowledge vectors, break into attackers with controlled aggression rather than blind chase. This mattered when the threat evolved. By late 1944 in the Philippines and then relentlessly at Okinawa, Japan committed special attack units, kamikaze, whose tactics compressed decision time to seconds. A dive bomber aiming a bomb could be bluffed by flak into a bad release. A pilot ramming his aircraft into a ship could not. That stripped away margins. The only answer was to multiply interruptions, kill high with cap, shred approach tracks with 5-inch VT bursts, force erratic last-second corrections with 40mm fire, and if all else failed, break the attacker's line with 20mm and maneuver. Reality refused to bend into neat diagrams. At Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the CVE groups, Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and the now legendary Taffy 3, learned under fire what it meant to be small decks in a large fight. They launched and recovered under the shadow of a Japanese surface force they were never meant to face. Later that same week, the escort carrier St. Lo became the first major warship sunk by a kamikaze when a zero-laden bomb detonated her after magazine. It was a brutal lesson. Even layered systems cannot claim perfection. But the doctrine held. The other CVs fought on, their aircraft harassing battleships with bombs and torpedoes, their guns throwing a storm that broke attack angles and bought time. Critically, the Navy did not abandon the concept. It refined it. More pickets, tighter. Fighter direction, improved damage control procedures, faster deck spotting to keep cap in the air. The response to a shock was not retreat, but iteration. Iteration defined the road to Okinawa. The campaign plan assumed weeks under pressure within range of Kyushu. That meant massed raids with names, kikusui, floating chrysanthemums, a series of coordinated strikes mixing conventional and special attack aircraft launched in waves across April-June 1945. Escort carriers would live near the amphibious lodgment, feeding close air support to the Army and Marine divisions grinding over ridges and tomb-scarred slopes. They would share the picket net and absorb blows by proximity. The Japanese intention was simple: crush the layer by number, overwhelm the fighter directors, flood the 5-inch envelopes, and turn the anchorage into a table of burning hulls. The American intention was equally clear: make every minute of approach lethal, keep cap stacked and refreshed, recover and relaunch with ruthless tempo, and keep damage within a band that repair crews could handle before the next wave. Technology alone did not carry that load. It was human endurance. Gunners who had stood to for hours found new reserves when the next bearing call came. Ordnance men worked in infernos, building belts with skins blistered by radiant heat. Pilots flew 3-4 sorties in a day, some limping home to short decks, with holes in wings and hydraulic lines spurting, because the math of the system required aircraft to be present at the right altitude and the right moment. Damage control parties rehearsed fire boundaries, shoring techniques, and magazine flooding as if they were choreography because sometimes survival depended on the speed of a single valve. The CVE's apparent fragility masked a hard interior, procedures that had no flourish, only consequences. Japanese aviators approaching a CVE group at Okinawa saw what their training told them to see: smaller carriers, fewer fighters, less speed. What they entered was something else, a defended volume. Radar chained to radios chained to interceptors, guns whose effectiveness no longer fell neatly with distance, ships practiced in mutual support, all of it designed to deny a clean run. That mismatch between expectation and reality is the heart of this story. It is why contempt became casualty. It is how small decks, mocked in peacetime parlance, hardened into wartime assets that could endure a season of fire. With the lattice in place, the sensors, the weapons, the doctrine, the people, we can now change scale. From the wide map to the human vantage points that make sense of it. From schematics to the eyes that watched the horizon and the hands that pulled the triggers. Human ACVE's edge was human tempo. Launch crews with grease-blackened hands moved by touch and glance, trading words for hand signals because engine roar ate language. An ordnance man wiped sweat with the back of his wrist and counted fuses again, not because he doubted the chart, because he respected the moment. Pilots lived inside a ritual that started before dawn. Brief, strap, run-up, launch, climb, scan. Each sortie bled into the next until time felt like a loop tied to the klaxon. Fatigue narrowed vision. Training widened it again. On the other track, Japanese airmen rose from fields that had once taught mastery and now taught urgency. Some were veterans who remembered a different sky. Many were new, with fewer hours, drilled in courage more than procedure. They carried belief and duty, and they found the American screen thicker than rumor. A man in a cockpit, either cockpit, makes decisions at the speed of breath. Dive angle, throttle, break into tracers or hold the line. Under the white blossoms of VT bursts, choices collapsed to instinct. On a small deck below, another man heaved a CO2 cylinder into place, and another turned a valve that kept a magazine cool. The machinery was steel. The resilience was flesh. What held the lattice together was people who understood that every 10 seconds had a job. Tactical escort carriers survived by turning space into a plan. Destroyers and escorts marked the ring. Radar pickets stretched the horizon. Combat air patrol layered above in altitude blocks that gave the fighter director options. Wildcats near, Hellcats higher, vectors braided so that raids were met early and broken before the last sprint. The CVE's launch cycle was a clock wound by wind and deck length. Spot 6 forward, 2 aft. Hold a section hot on the cat for the next alarm. Avengers rode the edges of the plan. ASW arcs when the air quieted. Close air support when the infantry called. Depth charges swapped for rockets without drama because doctrine put speed over spectacle. Gunnery discipline mattered as much as geometry. Sectors were assigned and kept. No ship blinded another's sightline. Tracers were information, not emotion. When a raid materialized, the group flexed. Cap pushed out on bearings. The screen tightened. The carrier angled for wind, to land one section while another throttled forward. Tactics were not tricks. They were habits rehearsed into reflex so that a formation could do 3 things at once: fight, recover, relaunch. That simultaneity, recovery under fire, turnaround under pressure, kept the air above the group populated. And populated air is what steals the clean shot from an attacker. Technological technology did not replace courage. It multiplied it. Radar gave vision through haze and distance. The fighter director's talker net turned returns into intercepts. The Hellcats' broad shoulders held armor, self-sealing tanks, and stability that made a good pilot better and a tired pilot safe. The FM-2 Wildcat, lighter, clawing, tough, fit the CVE like a glove. Quick off a short deck, nimble at low altitude, made to knife fight over the ship it guarded. Below, the gun tiers spoke different dialects of the same language. The 5-inch 38 with VT fuses drew invisible spheres in the air, near misses that became air mines. The 40mm Bofors translated bearing lines into hard punctuation that sawed through wings and spars. The 20mm Oerlikons were the last human veto, where tracers met paint and decisions ended. Fire control directors, Mk-51 sights, gyro leads, and steady ammo trains kept the cadence. Add to this the unseen, improved radios that held up under chaos, standardized brevity that let strangers cooperate instantly, damage control kits staged where it would be needed, not where it looked tidy. None of it was glamorous, all of it decisive. Together, these tools turned a jeep carrier group from a shape to be attacked into a defended volume to be respected. All of these angles set the stage for viewpoints outside the ring. How the enemy judged the small decks, how commanders scripted the lattice, and how ethics and endurance strained under a sky that kept sending waves. From the cockpit of a late-war Japanese attacker, the small American carrier looked like a solvable problem. The silhouette was low, the wake modest, the island unassuming. Doctrine and rumor said these were auxiliaries, less capi, thinner armor, slower turns. But the approach corridor told a different story. Radar-directed fighters appeared not as a single challenge but as a sequence, a high pair slashing down to force a break, a nearer pair waiting to catch the correction, then the disciplined silence of ships that did not open too early. A pilot, diving into that screen, discovered the mathematics of attrition. Fuel running down, options narrowing, the sight picture trembling as 5-inch bursts bracketed altitude, and 40 military streams stitched the path. Late-war training could still produce bravery, but it rarely produced the formation density and gunnery polish of 1942. Many flew aircraft that were agile but fragile against heavy fire, or fast but unforgiving in a pullout after damage. What seemed an easy target was actually a defended volume whose layers punished misjudgment. The error began on the ground, with the contempt that misreads small as weak, and ended in the last seconds over warm water, where the only geometry left was the curve of a smoking dive. Leadership made the lattice behave. Task group commanders positioned screens to buy seconds, not miles. Seconds are what fighter directors spend. Radar pickets were distributed to extend warning, accepting risk at the edge to protect the center. On the flight deck, air bosses ruled tempo, hot sections spotted forward, recovery windows carved from minimal wind, deck crews drilled to turn a landing into a relaunch without wasted motion. Fighter direction ran on clear priorities. Keep a cap on the group, push an intercept forward, preserve enough aircraft at altitude to blunt the second wave, not just the first. Destroyer captains enforced gunnery sectors and maneuvered to keep arcs clean. They also lived the unglamorous doctrine of smoke, denying aim points when the volume of fire alone could not. Damage control was leadership under heat. Isolate, flood, foam, vent, decisions made in minutes that decided whether a carrier fought again that afternoon. Crucially, doctrine evolved in contact. Lessons from Leyte about surprise, dispersion, and the cost of thin pickets translated into denser nets and stricter radio discipline by Okinawa. The plan was not static, it was a living instrument, tuned against an enemy who kept changing key. War compresses morality into timing. Escort carrier crews fought with the blunt honesty of defense. Keep transports safe, keep soldiers covered, keep the sea lanes open. On the other side, special attack units made the sky intimate, pilots turning aircraft into weapons with a decision that erased negotiation. The moral strain ran along every catwalk. Gunners slept in flashes, pilots strapped in with rituals that held fear in place. Chaplains wrote letters no one wanted to read. Yet the operational calculus never paused. Cap must be airborne. Ammo must be where hands can find it blind. Foam must reach the fire before the second wave does. The system asked for endurance rather than spectacle, and endurance has a cost, measured in hearing loss to Beaufort's thunder and nerves frayed by the klaxon. No one romanticized a CVE after a long day. They respected it. The ethic became simple. Do your 10 seconds perfectly so another man can do his. That ethic carried into the decisive hours at Okinawa, where contempt met a wall of practiced will, and where the smallest decks held their place in a sky that kept demanding more. The viewpoints converge now at a single horizon line. The day, A massed raid met a layered defense and the air itself seemed to ignite. Dawn patrols had already circled out. The first bearings came in tight and fast. April 6th, 1945, Kikusui I. When hundreds of Navy and Army aircraft surged off Kyushu toward the fleet and the support groups ringed around Okinawa. The pickets felt it first. A destroyer on the outer line took the opening blow at 12:26, and soon others were fighting for their lives, some burning, some already listing, while the carrier groups tightened formation and stacked their cap. The escort carriers were close to the lodgment, where their short decks mattered most. That made them visible, tempting, and very much inside the storm's path. The defended volume came alive. Radar scopes painted long strings of returns. The fighter director's talkers turned them into vectors. Hellcats from the fast carriers dropped in from altitude. Wildcats clawed up from the CVEs, quick off short decks with full flaps and nerves held flat. Intercepts met the first wedges of the raid well forward, slashing, climbing, breaking again to spoil cohesion. Behind that, knife work, the ships set their cadence. 5-inch 38s loading VT, directors settling, Bofors teams checking tracers in lead. The plan, refined since Leyte and drilled through months of amphibious pushes, was simple. Cut the raid in layers until whatever remained was too thin and too shaken to land a clean strike. But April 6th was not a neat diagram. Special attack aircraft were mixed with conventional bombers, fighters, and scouts. Some dived clean, some came low and crooked, riding the backs of whitecaps to steal seconds from the gunners. Out on the edge, radar picket destroyers Bush and Colhoun would not survive. The day, Newcomb and Leyte were mauled. The message back to every carrier group was stark and useful. The raids were real, numerous, and willing to trade airframes for impact. Cap would have to stay thick. Ammunition trains could not falter. Recovery and relaunch would happen while the sky was still bitter with cordite. On a CVE flight deck, tempo became the only luxury. Wildcats thumped aboard with scarred fabric and fuel needles low, hooks catching as LSO paddles carved firm signals through prop wash. Chocks in, wings down, fuel and ammo by muscle memory, a new section already hot on the cat. The air boss bought minutes by turning the ship hard to wind, stealing extra knots for the launch. A recovered Avenger was shoved aft and struck below to clear the landing area. The next pair of fighters took the deck edge for a rolling start. The choreography, so often practiced in quiet seas, now bled into gunnery. 5-inch mounts tracking targets bracketed by radar. Bofors teams firing in long, steady strings. Oerlikon gunners holding until the last, because undisciplined fire blinded friends as easily as it hit foes. The wall of bursts, air mines to altitude, hard streams closer in, changed the geometry of every approach path. The Japanese pilots pressing in on the small decks found the path narrowing. Intercepts kept coming, staggered in height like invisible gates. A slash that forced a jettison, a turn that ruined a dive angle. A second pair, waiting to catch the correction. Those who broke through hit the envelopes drawn by proximity fuses, near misses that were no longer harmless, shells that bloomed white and lethal around wings and canopies. A lucky machine could still bore on, but luck has a short half-life in a defended volume. Even so, the pressure never felt abstract on a CVE. Lookouts called bearings. Directors chattered. Something always seemed to be coming from a bad quarter. On another horizon, a hospital ship took a hit. On a nearer one, a landing ship listed and smoked. The system worked, but it bled to do so. Escorts earned their place in every minute of the hour. Destroyers threw smoke when an angle looked clean, then opened fire through their own haze. A CVE eased her bow to make wind for a recovery and expose a fresh arc of guns. Magazine crews worked by rote steps, cooling, isolating, flooding boundaries on command. Because the lesson from Leyte was tattooed on every ready room wall. A single blast below could finish what no pilot above had managed. St. Lo's loss. The previous October had written that lesson in flame and water. Nobody in these groups wanted to read it again. The first hour broke the rhythm of the attackers but did not finish them. Kikusui I was built in mass. and mass arrives in waves. As the cap rotated, new bearings stacked on the board, and the director parceled what he had. Keep enough fighters high to break the next spearhead. Send a pair nearer to catch leakers. Never empty the altitude gate entirely. Down on the deck, Wildcats trapped, fueled, and went again. The little FM2s doing exactly what they were built to do. Climb quickly from a short run and knife fight over a ship they could almost touch with their wingtips. Up higher, Hellcat. Drivers played the longer game, roping in bombers and kamikazes before they could begin their dives. The partnership felt seamless because doctrine had made it so. Big ship fighters thinning raids at range, small ship fighters protecting the center where seconds mattered most. By late afternoon, the sky over the support groups looked like a palimpsest of smoke trails and burst patterns. The carriers still had their decks. Many pickets did not. Damage reports read like a grim ledger. Names, frames, compartments, numbers. And still the cycle continued. Recover one section, launch one section, feed the cap that kept the next wave ragged. The defenders knew the day would end only when the attackers ran out of fuel, courage, or luck. They also knew the calendar. April 6th was only the beginning of a season. Kikusui would come again on April 7th and again after that, while the troops ashore forced their way along ridges and through villages that hid fields of fire. The escort carriers could not leave. Their task was to be present, and presence meant absorbing pressure without surrendering flight operations. That was the turn. In the war's texture, contempt had met a system, and systems, when tended, endure. In the morning light of April 7th, the pattern would repeat with a cruel addition. A surface thrust by Yamato and her escorts, run down and destroyed under the same umbrella of carrier aviation that fed the cap above the CVEs. The message to every pilot and every gun captain on the small decks was blunt. This was a continuous fight at two scales, raids in the near sky and a distant killing of a legend at sea. The lattice had to hold for both, and it did, long enough for smoke to thin and the next scramble order to sound like a familiar, terrible bell. The day had not decided everything, but it had decided enough to change the tone of the campaign. The raids would keep coming, the carriers would keep flying. To see how the defense tightened under cumulative strain, how deck crews, cap and gunners fought the second wave and the third until evening, we go deeper into the same sky. Afternoon built a pressure all its own. The first waves of Kikusui, I had been cut and scattered, but mass does not feel pain the same way a pilot does. It keeps coming until arithmetic runs out. The radar scopes still showed strings of returns. Bearings rolled in like surf. Over the picket line, the evidence was already written in steel. Bush and Colhoun gone, Leyte and Newcomb torn open. Hainsworth the first struck in the opening hours. Every report fed the doctrine. Keep cap thick. Keep decks turning. Keep ammunition trains flowing without pause. The escort carriers stayed on station near the lodgement because the infantry ashore needed them more than the carriers needed distance. That proximity drew attention and fire. A CVE group in the inner ring faced a choreography that never stopped. Wildcats trapped with holes in fabric and chipped props, hooks biting the wire as paddles flashed firm signals through the prop wash. Chocks in, fuel, belts. A hot section already spotted forward. The air boss stole knots with the bow into wind, while the gunnery officers' world stayed on bearings and angles. The 5-inch 38s worked their geometry with proximity, VT fusees, detonations not at impact but in the near air around wings and canopies, turning the gap between a miss and a kill into a narrow band of ruin. Beaufort's crews kept their long, disciplined strings. Orlikon gunners did not fire early. Fire control was a language of restraint. The fleet had learned this the hard way. Undisciplined tracers blinded friends faster than they killed enemies. The day's survival rested as much on patience as on volume. Tactically, the trap sprang the same way every time and still demanded perfection each time. Fighter direction stacked the cap in altitude blocks. Hellcats from the fast carrier task groups roped the incoming wedges well forward. Wildcats from the CVEs waited nearer the center to catch leakers whose dives had been ruined, whose fuel clocks were red, whose hands were tired. A diving attacker met slashing intercepts. Then the invisible spheres of 5-inch bursts, Then the hard stitching of 40 millimeters, then, only if everything else failed, the last human veto at 20 millimeters ranges. Most never got that far. Those that did were often already smoking or misaligned, the difference between a glancing strike and a mortal one decided in a heartbeat by a gun captain's lead correction or a ship handler's small, brutal turn. U.S. analysis after the war would say plainly what men on the catwalks already believed by instinct. The VT-fused 5-inch was the decisive anti-aircraft weapon against suicide attack, because it erased the luxury of near miss. Not. Every equation resolved cleanly. One CVE might ride out a near miss that sheared antennas and peppered the flight deck. Another might take a glancing blow that tore planes from the catwalk and sprayed the deck with fragments. Damage control parties moved by choreography, boundary set, flood here, foam there, because they knew what a single chain of errors could do. The lesson was not abstract. 5 months earlier at Leyte Gulf, St. Lo had disappeared in a column of flame and smoke after a kamikaze's bomb reached the aftermagazine. First major warship lost to a suicide strike. That memory lived on every ready room wall as a quiet order. Keep the ship alive so the next launch can happen. By late afternoon, the defended volume looked like a palimpsest. Layers of smoke arcs, burst rosettes, and contrails, new patterns, written on the fading ghosts of the old. Reports from the picket line remained grim. Destroyers and destroyer minesweepers carrying a burden designed to buy seconds for everyone else. And yet the inner rings endured. Ammunition expenditure was huge but steady. Cap rotations never collapsed because the deck cycles never did. Wildcats went again and again, doing the short deck work they were built for. Hellcats above kept the longer leash on formations trying to gather for a fresh dive. Aircraft and pilots were tired, but the system kept buying the same 10 seconds over and over. That is what a defended volume really is. Time, multiplied. The next morning brought a cruel coda and a confirmation. On April 7th, while new waves probed, the ring over Okinawa, the largest battleship ever built, Yamato, steamed south with Yahagi and 8 destroyers, a surface thrust that could not survive in a sky owned by carrier air. Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58 launched hundreds of sorties. Torpedoes and bombs broke the Japanese formation and rolled the Titan onto her side until her magazines went, a pillar of smoke trembling above the East China Sea. To men on small decks, that distant column looked like proof of the same logic that kept their own decks alive. Massed aviation, disciplined direction, and relentless tempo beat prestige and weight. The same lattice that fed their cap was the one that unmade a legend. As Kikusui finally ebbed, a ledger took shape. The U.S. had lost pickets and lives. Several inner ring ships were damaged. Many more bore fresh scars, splintered stanchions, pocked plating, ruptured fire mains repaired underway. Yet the escort carriers were still flying close air support. The lodgment still had its umbrella. The Japanese had traded airframes and pilots in terrible numbers, and too many of those sacrifices had ended not in hits, but in white blossoms of airbursts and contrails shredded by slashing fighters. Historians would tally the period, from April 6 through late June, as a season of suicide raids in 10 named waves. But the heart of it was here in these first 48 hours, when contempt for jeep carriers met a system that refused to let a single bearing decide a battle. The sky dimmed. The carriers turned into wind one last time and brought the stragglers home. Fires burned out on the horizons where pickets had fought their separate wars. Night stations set, and men slept in their clothes. In the morning, this routine would resume, brief strap launch. The season wasn't over. Kikusui 2 would come on April 12th. Others would follow. The measure of what had changed could be seen in small things. A deck still open, a radio net still crisp, an infantry company ashore still getting rockets and bombs on call. That is what victory looked like at the scale of an escort carrier. The ability to do it again tomorrow. We can now count what that endurance cost, ships and men, ammunition and aircraft, and how the lessons hardened into doctrine for the rest of the campaign. When the smoke thins, the first ledger is physical. Ships either make way under their own power or they do not. At Okinawa, the price fell heaviest on the picket line. Destroyers and smaller craft that absorbed the opening blows to buy everyone else warning time. Many were lost outright. Many more came off the line with torn plating, flooded compartments, and gun crews replaced twice over in a single week. Inside the inner rings, the escort carriers showed what repetition under fire can do. Several took damaging hits in the season of raids, flight decks scorched and holed, catwalks ripped away, ready service lockers blasted open. But the pattern across the campaign held: deck fires contained, magazines cooled, steering restored, and flight operations resumed on timelines measured in hours and days, not weeks. The Jeep carrier nickname had described size, not stamina. The second ledger is aerial. Across April through June, the attackers lost aircraft in numbers that no training pipeline could replace. Interceptions at altitude cost formations their cohesion. Proximity fused 5-inch bursts turned near miss into attrition. The 40mm belts did their work in the last seconds when angles narrowed. Tallies vary by raid and by record, but the shape is consistent. The first named mass attacks were met with heavy losses in the approach. The later waves, flying into tighter doctrine and more seasoned gunnery, bled even more. Hellcats at height, and Wildcats in the near box shared the kills. Corsairs, where present, added reach and speed. What mattered to the men on the small decks was not the number inked to a board, but the fact that close air support sorties still launched on schedule. The next morning, if infantry ashore still heard TBM engines in the dawn, the system had worked. Ammunition tells its own story. Expenditure rates ran hot, especially in the first 48 hours of the opening raid, when gun crews learned how fast proximity fuses could turn a stack of shells into a protective volume. Logistics trails flexed to keep up, barges shuttled, magazines were cross-leveled, and errand destroyers became lifelines that arrived with Bofors clips, Oerlikon drums, and 5-inch powder cans just as ready-use racks went thin. The ability to sustain fire without going blind, holding discipline on tracers, maintaining sector control, proved as decisive as the quantity itself. Under that discipline, ammunition turned from weight into time. Every belt delivered meant another minute the cap could reposition and another landing could be waved aboard. Damage control kept its quiet statistics. Fires that would have gutted a ship in 1942 were contained behind drilled boundaries in 1945. Foam systems came on faster. Ventilation runs were sealed in the first minute, not the fifth. Flooding was applied to magazines and struck compartments without the paralyzing debates that once cost ships the chance to fight again. Men carried new scars, and some carried none at all because procedures now reached them before heat did. On a CVE, where compartments are tight and the flight deck is the ship's lung, that difference between trained choreography and improvisation often meant whether a carrier was still, launching by sunset. Operationally, the escort carriers did what they were built to do. They stayed present. Close air support to the beaches did not cease because a flight deck was scarred or an island stud was bent. It paused, was patched, and resumed. Anti-submarine. Patrols continued to comb the lanes where troop ships and ammunition ships made their slow procession. Ferry missions still delivered fresh aircraft to forward fields. Presence, measured as the ability to keep aircraft cycling over the lodgement and the convoy, meant amphibious momentum did not stall even when the picket line paid in blood. The smallest decks, mocked in peacetime language, proved large enough to carry a campaign's daily weight. There is a human ledger that cannot be reduced to totals. Gun crews returned to their mounts with ringing ears that never stopped. Pilots slept, in fragments between launches. Flight deck parties hauled hot metal out of the way so that wheels could roll again. Letters went out from chaplains whose hands smelled of smoke. Yet the tone aboard changed in a way that matters. The contempt that once shadowed the escort carriers from enemy cockpits did not survive repeated contact with a defended volume. The crews could feel it in angles abandoned earlier, in dives broken higher, in attackers arriving more scattered and more uncertain as the weeks went on. Contempt had met a system, and systems harden with each repetition. The numbers and names that historians would compile after the campaign, ships lost and saved, Aircraft claimed and confirmed. Days when flight ops fell silent and days when they beat the clock lead directly into the quieter ledger of lessons. Those lessons would shape the next weeks of Okinawa and live beyond it. How to position pickets without creating single points of failure. How to keep cap thick without starving the beachhead of support. How to manage deck cycles under continuous warning. They are the bridge from cost to consequence, and they form the spine of the final assessment. Doctrine stiffened in contact. The first lesson was about time, not space. Warning seconds mattered more than defensive miles. Radar pickets were essential, but dispersion had to avoid isolating a single ship at the end of too many vectors. Pairing pickets, backing them with ready relief and tying them to fighter direction with strict brevity codes trimmed the worst risks. Inside the ring, commanders learned to trade geometry for tempo, turning to wind sooner, recovering short sections more often, and accepting higher deck cycle cadence to keep the altitude gates filled. The escort carrier's flight deck became a metronome that never stopped, even if it meant bringing aboard damaged fighters simply to refuel and launch them again with patched skins and steady hands. Fighter doctrine refined the split between range and reaction. High cover from fast carriers kept reach and energy against raid leaders and bombers forming up. CVE-based Wildcats guarded the center and punished leakers whose dives were already bent out of true. The method was not glamorous. Staggered sections, altitude blocks, and crisp handoffs from controller to controller. But it soaked the approach in attrition before the 5-inch belts even started to climb the hoists. Within that architecture, pilots adjusted tactics for suicide attack, front quarter slashes timed to force premature dives, conservative chases that avoided tunnel vision, and disciplined returns before fuel turned risk into roulette. CAP management turned from an art into a schedule that could survive shock. Gunnery drew its own hard conclusions. Proximity fuses demanded restraint to keep the sky clear for friendlies. Fire control teams drilled range gates and fuse setting, routines until air mines appeared at the intended altitudes, not wishfully. Bofors crews learned to hold long, steady strings across predicted paths rather than chase each glint. Earlicon gunners practiced the last veto, firm, late, and clean, because early tracers stole sight from the ships that still had a shot. Ammunition discipline followed. Ready-use stocks were staged by likelihood of need. Resupply lines were rehearsed in daylight and at night. Errand ships carried the right mix of 5-inch VT, 40mm clips, and 20mm drums to restore a group's fighting. Posture between waves. Logistics, seen from a CVE's catwalk, looked like destiny in wooden crates. Damage control matured into choreography that junior sailors could execute without waiting for heroics. Magazine boundaries were not abstract lines on a diagram. They were valves and wedges every man could find in the dark. Foam, flooding, and vent control happened in the first minute, not the 5th. Fire parties rehearsed around live heat so that real heat did not surprise them. Engineering teams treated steering and power as weapons, rerouting, isolating, and restoring to keep the ship maneuvering into wind and holding arcs for the guns. After Leyte and the early Okinawa raids, no one on a CVE assumed that a single, lucky hit must end flight operations. The new assumption was that a drilled ship could bend and continue. Operational ethics also clarified. The escort carrier's purpose, presence for troops ashore, protection for the lanes, sat above the desire to chase glory or avoid risk. That ethic hardened choices. A CVE did not sprint away to save herself if troops needed bombs at first. Light. She reduced profile, repaired through the night, and planned to launch at dawn. Destroyers did not drift from stations when the bearings looked ugly. They laid smoke and bore down on angles that cut aim points. Pilots accepted short, repeated sorties because coverage at the right minute mattered more than long-range sweeps that left gaps. The calculus had nothing mystical in it. It was arithmetic aligned to purpose. Strategically, the season of raids revealed limits that technology alone could not hide. No defense could erase all risk to small decks operating near a lodgement under mass attack. The cost fell unevenly. Pickets bled to buy warning. Inner rings took scars to keep the cycle turning. And some carriers paid dearly in single moments that no doctrine could fully prevent. Yet the exchange rate moved inexorably. Japanese fuel, training hours, and airframes declined faster than the U.S. capacity to patch holes, replace aircraft, and rotate crews. Each failed mass attack left the lattice stronger, controllers more fluent, gunners more measured, deck cycles more exact. By campaign's end, contempt for jeep carriers had vanished from the conversation that mattered, within range of their guns and above their short decks. They were not invulnerable, they were indispensable. They ferried, guarded, and most importantly stayed. In staying, they preserved the amphibious tempo that the entire strategy required. If the question at the start of the war had been whether tiny carriers could survive under a major air threat, the answer by Okinawa read like a procedure. Yes. When part of a system that sees first, intercepts early, fires with discipline, repairs fast, and keeps launching. The numbers attached to places and names. Men remember the sound of the 5-inch cycle and the smell of scorched non-skid. Historians stitch departures and returns into tables. But the meaning settles into a quieter register. The smallest decks had proved that a web of technology and human routine could turn mockery into miscalculation. And that meaning carries directly into the final lens. What the experience of these ships says about war, about systems, and about the arrogance that so often precedes loss. History remembers silhouettes, the grand carriers, the battleships, with names like pronouncements. But war is often decided by quieter shapes that refuse to break. The escort carrier was one of them. Small, improvised, and everywhere, a CVE did not win attention. It won time. Radar gave minutes. Fighter direction multiplied those minutes into chances. Proximity fuses turned chances into survival. Human routine bound the chain. 10 seconds. At a time. Contempt is a rule in war, and it exacts attacks. Japanese aviators who mocked jeep carriers were not wrong about dimensions or speed. They were wrong about systems. A defended volume has no single face. It is the sum of pickets. You cannot see controllers you never meet, gunners you underestimate, and pilots who arrive exactly when arithmetic says they must. It is smoke laid at the right second. A turn for wind made 3 beats early. A magazine valve closed before heat makes its argument. In that mathematics, the small deck acquires a moral gravity. It stands not for prestige, but for reliability. Technology mattered, but never in isolation. VT fuses, radar nets, and rugged airframes made mediocre choices less deadly and good choices decisive. Yet each was only as useful as the discipline around it. The crew's restraint, Leyte Orlikon, fire held Beaufort strings, altitude gates never emptied, was the invisible edge. The same discipline allowed damage control to treat catastrophe as a sequence, not a verdict. Systems rewarded humility and punished swagger, and the Pacific learned both lessons. Okinawa's season of raids pressed those truths into steel. The smallest decks kept launching because thousands of ordinary actions were performed without flourish. That steadiness protected soldiers who would never know the names of the men who turned wrenches in wind and flame. It also revealed a larger law. In industrial war, strength emerges not only from what you build, but from how you synchronize it, how you keep presence through fatigue, how you make every mile of ocean a problem for your enemy and every minute of approach a negotiation with risk. The escort carrier was proof. Mockery could not survive contact with a coherent network. The sky over Okinawa did not crown the small decks with glory. It did something better. It made their persistence undeniable.